Hello everyone and welcome to the Module 3, Topic 3.2 Contract Terms. This is the video for Learning Objective Number 3, Contract Interpretation. I have to find a better place to put my picture. Okay, so having talked about assignment and delegation and duty, breach, and remedies, now in this module we will talk about how to interpret a contract. What are the rules of interpretation? Because as you might have imagined by the discussion so far, there are many examples where the parties after the fact don't agree on what the contract means. And so we have to decide what are the rules for coming to a conclusion, a consistent conclusion about what a contract means. And that's what our contract interpretation rules are. So we're going to look at the different types of ways that you do that. And what the relative weight is that's given by a court. There's an order, a value, relative value of different kinds of evidence. And then we'll look specifically at the parole evidence rule, which has to do with whether you allow previous negotiations in as evidence of what the parties intended or not. And usually you don't, but there's some conditions that you have to deal with in order for that rule to apply. And then last, we talk about how we deal with ambiguity. How does a court deal with ambiguity? Okay, so let's get to it. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that you can interpret a contract. One is you read it, and hopefully it's clear, and its plain meaning becomes very clear. I agree to repay my loan at however much a month in principal and interest. That's pretty clear. The plain meaning is pretty clear. There's not a whole lot of space for debate about what my obligation is. One term that we often, one standard we often use is what would a reasonable person assume that language means. So we don't look necessarily at what the specific parties might think it means, but instead what would a reasonable member of the public, if asked to interpret the contract, what would they say? And so that's what a reasonable person standard is. And then we can also look at the subjective intent. What is intended by the specific party in the specific case? Okay, so these are the different kinds of ways that we can look at contract interpretation. Okay, so how do we do that? What's the relative weight of this? So starting at the top, the terms of the contract get the most weight. That means the court will look first at what the term of the contract says. Then, after it does that, it moves down. If it can't figure out the answer, it moves down to see what terms can be implied by the contract. So if a mortgage loan says that I'm going to make my payments every month, and it doesn't say where, or maybe it doesn't even say US dollars, it's going to be implied that I have to send my check to the bank in US dollars. And the court can imply that. We look then at specific terms, like what specific terms exist, and so we can infer from what the specific terms are. Then we look at how much time did the parties spend negotiating a term. If they were really actively negotiated terms, then we give them more weight. And if they were sort of ignored, they were just boilerplate language. The court can then take into account the totality of the circumstances, all of this from above. We can look at the purpose of the contract. So if it's a mortgage loan contract, it's for the repayment of money. It's not for personal services or other things. It's so we can interpret into the contract some meaning by what the contract was designed for in the first place. And then we can look at other writing. So if there were some memoranda, or if there were some exhibits, or other things like that aren't in the contract, but that were part of the contract or around the drafting of the contract. Then we can also look at the context of it, which is a lot like the purpose. It's what was the context of it? Was it done? When was it done? Why was it done? Who was it done between? What were the relative sophistication of the parties? That sort of thing. Then if we still can't decide, we can look at, well, what's common in the industry? What would normally be in a contract like that? So then we can look at that. And then lastly, on this list, against the drafter, what that means is that any ambiguous term is, the general rule is that whoever drafted the term, you interpret it against the drafter. So you penalize the drafter for a ambiguous term, although most major and well-written contracts will have a provision in it that will say something like the parties agree that they both equally drafted it, so it avoids this kind of problem. So, but the court will start at the top and work their way down to try to interpret the meaning of a provision that they can't agree on. Okay, so then what's parole evidence? Parole evidence is, and it's sometimes pronounced parole, but I say parole. It looks like parole to me. But in either case, this deals with: do we use the negotiations that occurred before the signing? Do we use those as evidence to understand what the contract meant? And there's a reason why this is such a big deal, because a lot of times and we saw this in the exercise we did last week. You saw how many times you went back and forth on a provision or a term. Well, what this rule says is that you cannot use that back and forth to try to understand what the final agreement was. And the reason that this rule exists is because we want parties to actively negotiate. If they're afraid that every time they say something that it might be used later to interpret the contract, then it would discourage free and open conversations and negotiations. So that's why this rule exists. But in order for it to exist, you have to actually have a final agreement. You actually have to have some evidence of the final agreement, usually a signed contract, and in order for that to apply. If you didn't get that far, if you just negotiated and the contract is implied, then the negotiations can be used as evidence. And the way that you make sure that this works, and you'll see this in almost every major contract, is you have an integration clause. And this is a provision that the purpose of which is to make sure that parole evidence isn't used. So I have an example here. This comes from a real contract. And so you'll see it says, this contract contains the entire agreement of the parties. So there's it's saying that everything we agree to is in this document. With respect to the subject matter, the contract supersedes any prior agreements, understandings, or negotiations, whether written or oral. So you can't say, well, I know I signed this document, but what I really meant was what we were talking about right before we signed it. We all agree that this document represents the final agreement, and that you can only amend this contract through a written document. Okay, this is a classic integration clause that, and the purpose of it is to make sure that parole evidence isn't used. And when you look at a real contract, then you'll see lots of provisions like this. You'll see lots of provisions dealing with consequential damages, like we talked about in the last video, the integration clause here. Contract will, the more complicated it is, the more stuff like this you have in it. It can sometimes go on for pages and pages and pages with all of this, what looks like very boilerplate language, but it's there because of a particular rule, and in this case, it's the parole evidence rule. Okay, so that's it for learning objective number 3, and I hope these videos were helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Thank you.